I'm very proud and happy to be here at the opening of at the inauguration or launch of this very exciting Institute for Social Justice at the university here, which is, it has a very, very important and exciting agenda. And I hope that what I'm going to talk about here relates, I think it does, but it may not be immediately evident that it relates to that agenda. So the language animal, I suppose students of philosophy here immediately smell Aristotle. It's another way of translating Aristotle's famous phrase about human beings being zoa echon logon, the animals possessing logos, which we sometimes have been tempted to translate rational animals, and I think that's too narrow, that we need to take the full stretch of language, so I'm calling us language animals. Now, because Aristotle was right, basically, that in order to understand human beings, you have to understand them as animals with language. So it gets to be very important to understand exactly what linguistic capacity is. And there we have a big raging battle going on since the Renaissance, really. So I want to start with the first theory put forward, truly sort of post-medieval theory put forward of language. That is a theory which didn't assume that language is somehow embedded in the cosmos, that the cosmos is a text to be read or an order that has to be understood as linguistically based, like in the theories of the Kabbalah, etc. Not that, incidentally, I think that those theories were entirely wrong, but that this first theory that I want to quickly sketch out, because I want to attack it afterwards and define my view in relation and against it, this theory that I'm talking about, the first theory, resolutely set that kind of issue aside about the cosmic embedding of language. Language is a purely human possibility, a purely human instrument. And the people that I think are the main thinkers you have to read to get this theory clear are Hobbes, Locke, and Condillac. So, because I like initials, I call this in my book the HLC theory, right? Okay. And the HLC theory is really what you could call designative and instrumental. Well, those two words I want before our minds, because I'm going to oppose them with another theory, which I want to call expressive and constitutive. But let's designative and instrumental. Designative in the following sense that words are seen as introduced in order to designate, to name, as it were, stick onto phenomena which are perceived and noticed by us. Incidentally, that theory originally was very much under the influence of a post-Cartesian conception of our building up a picture of the universe atomistically from particular perceptions into a broader theory. And it also was very much in the Cartesian world, Cartesian tradition, being very dualistic. So Locke, for instance, says that strictly speaking, we are not naming objects in the world, we're naming primarily ideas in the mind which we think, refer to, or in some ways copy objects in the world. So we start off with a designative theory. Now, what do words thus used designatively do for us? Well, they enable us to build a picture of the universe. How? There are three ways that they're very instrumental in building a science of the world. First of all, they all say, Hobbes and Locke, that when you use a word, you're grasping a general, generic, universal idea as against a particular, right? So it introduces us into the world of general laws. Secondly, these words can be combined in various ways, and the insights that we pick up in them can be combined to make a larger picture of the world. Thirdly, we can use them to communicate with others. And so the new science which people saw developing post-Galileo, which people already recognized was something that could only be done by collaboration, right? This can be facilitated by language in its facet of giving us the means to communicate our ideas to each other, right? So that is you can see that designative, the words designate each word some particular idea, but instrumental because they are very, very useful, indeed essential for an absolutely important and essential human function, which is grasping what the world is like, building a picture of the universe around us. Now, as against that, we have in the Romantic period, which is why the original, as I said, the original idea of the book was going to talk about Romantic poetics as well, and I hope to do that in a later book. It's precisely in the Romantic period that we get a reaction against that. So once again, I have triple initials for you. There are three H's in this case: Hamann, Herder, Humboldt. I could think of Heidegger, Hegel, but let's take those three: Hamann, Herder, Humboldt, which are the origin point of what I want to call the rival theory, the HHH theory. Hamann is perhaps the one who starts it off, but Herder developed already very important features of that. And this is what I want to call expressive constitutive. But right away what strikes you is that it's not simply seeing language as an instrument. It sees the introduction of language, the rising, coming to be of language, as changing the way we live in the world. I mean, we're now tempted to use Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty type expressions about being in the world, être au monde. Language alters the way in which we live in the universe. So it's not simply an instrument which allows us to carry out previously existing goals. It is something which alters our gamut of goals, alters what we find essential to human life. So I want to get this idea across with another diptych of terms, expressive constitutive. Well, let's expressive first. I want to use this term in a way that's a little bit off-center from the way it's usually used, but it's pointing to a picture of human life of the following kind. Human beings, of course, have certain fundamental goals. They understand themselves as having certain important potentialities, and they strive to realize these. As it were, a non-expressive theory would present this as something that's already obvious to us, something that we have a grasp of in our minds. The whole expressive theory, however, expressivist theory, sees this as something that develops, our understanding of our goals develops, and it develops partly, indeed largely, through our trying to realize them, and then coming to have a realize in the sense of bring about, right? Realize in the sense of bringing into existence, but realize in the other sense of grasping is something that we begin to do after we start trying. So we get this very important picture of human life, very different from the earlier one, which you can see is utterly central to the philosophical tradition that comes downstream from the Romantics. For instance, in Hegel, it's very clear that this is an idea of the human existence, which starts off trying to realize itself in the sense of making itself real, and then comes to understand itself better and better. On this view, there's a kind of back and forth between attempts to realize and attempts to understand what we've been trying to do, leading to a further change in our understanding of what we're on about, which lead to further attempts, and so on. There's a back and forth, in other words, between, let's put it this way, what are our basic goals? How do we grasp our basic goals, our basic potentiality? Well, we move between two media in trying to understand them. The medium of language, of course, but also the medium of action, of enactment, right? So, I mean, let's just take a couple of examples that I think make this very, very obvious. That, for instance, we learn among our most important goals are that we learn as human beings are our most important ethical goals, ethical virtues, right? And how do we learn them. Well, let's think of the great teachers of history. Socrates, we have to start with Socrates. We're dealing with the philosophy descending from the Greeks, but also Jesus, the Buddha. We can go on with examples. And we have to ask ourselves, what is it, how do we get to really understand what they're on about? Well, without a certain dimension, which is the dimension of grasping an exemplar, human beings an exemplar, our understanding is very incomplete. Oh, Socrates says, the unexamined life isn't worth living. So the idea of the examined life is what we should be aiming at. Well, what is the examined life? You could imagine the jurors deciding whether to make him drink the hemlock. What's this examined life nonsense? I'm voting for the hemlock. But because they didn't really understand it, what do you need? One of the crucial things you need to understand it is to see what he was doing. We read the dialogues and we get an idea of what he means by the unexamined life. You have to read the New Testament to get an idea of what agape is about. You have to read about the life of the Buddha and all the different stories and so on in order to get an idea of what he's aiming at and so on. So we find that we can't really learn ethical goals without moving between, if you might, two media. The media of realization exemplars that we can get either by meeting them or by reading about them or by stories about them on one hand, and an attempt to grasp in concepts what this goal is. And we're always moving back and forth. There's a kind of antiphonal relation between two languages, something that will come again and again and again in the theory I want to present to you, that an antiphonal relation between attempts to understand something in two media, the medium of action, the medium of description. Okay, expressive, that's what I mean by expressive. Well, now constitutive, and I think this is the really important point where we can see what's wrong with the HLC. Why constitutive? Well, because if you ask yourself what it is to understand some of these basic ethical predicates that we operate with, or any sort of fundamentally important human meanings that we operate with to describe ourselves, to prescribe certain actions, and so on, we find that we couldn't conceive that we would have an actual experience of feeling and as it were, grasping and understanding without the words. Consider for a minute absolutely crucial ethical distinctions or distinctions that we want to make about human life, between anger and indignation, between love and admiration, between happiness in some more general sense and joy, so on. What we're dealing with here is distinctions we make which can only be understood in terms of deeper evaluations which are inconceivable without language. When I'm mad at you, I'm mad at you. When I'm indignant, there has to be an element here that I'm mad at you because you've done something very wrong. Right? Without that ethical dimension, we couldn't have the distinction, anger, indignation. We couldn't, for instance, see through somebody who is pretending to be indignant when really he isn't. He's really angry because the reason is nothing to do with our having done something wrong. We wouldn't be able to operate in that whole medium without the language which allows us to make these distinctions. Of a non-language animal, a dog, a chimpanzee, and so on, you couldn't make these distinctions. Or that's, if you want to look at it from that point of view, you want to look at it from the diachronic experience, supposing that I'm one of the people I just described. Negatively, that is, I'm fooling myself and thinking that I have a high moral stance, and I'm not. I'm very, very, I say that I'm full of remorse, moral remorse, for instance, but you see more deeply into me and you see that, in fact, I'm looking bad and I'm angry and mad at myself and very sorry that I'm looking so bad, right? But I'm not really actuated by a sense that that was something terribly wrong, and I'm contrite about it, right? And let's say that you get across to me that that's what's going on. And this is an important part of growing up and developing, that these insights, maybe you don't do it to me, maybe I sit at home and think about it, but in any case, I go through this change interpretation of what I was doing, how I was reacting. And that change interpretation, which involves making distinction between feeling bad, looking bad, and feeling bad because I've done something really wrong, alters the very nature of the experience. The experience becomes something different. The felt experience becomes something different. Right? So you could say that our being able to develop our understanding of our goals, our potentialities, or in this case our ethical goals, is something that understanding is mediated by our coming to take on a new vocabulary. So prior to that, there's obviously a sense of, no, I'm not quite understanding myself properly, there's something makes me uneasy, etc., about this reaction of mine. But when I get this distinction, somebody gets across to me this distinction between feeling bad but looking bad and feeling bad because I've done something wrong, if you like, the experience, the felt experience, regestalts with the acquisition of these words, or a sense of these words apply. So we've now reached the heart of one of the modes of the constitutive. You see, if we go back to the HLC, that theory is the semantic logic by which new words are introduced into our vocabulary is one where we have an experience. We see something, we have an idea in the mind, triggered off by something out there for Locke, and we give it a name, right? So the object is prior and the name is posterior. It's added on. In the case of these meanings we've been looking at, it's in a certain sense the other way around. I mean, not totally, but that the words enable the shift in experience. The words enable a new shape of experience, right? And that's one of the senses that I think you have to recognize as part of the notion of constitutive theory of language. The Herderian, or the Triple H, is a constitutive theory of language because it recognizes that language is not always posterior to experience, but language also can, in certain cases, enable experience. Right? So let's take these two semantic logics. There's a semantic logic in which we discover a new species of, we arrive in Australia for the first time and we discover a new species of rodent or what have you, and then we give it a name, right? That's one semantic logic. And the other semantic logic is that we develop more refined vocabulary, groping towards something more adequate to our experience, and that enables the experience to come about. And the problem is that for the HLC, it's always simply, let's call it the designative semantic logic, is the only one that they recognize, which gives us a little bit of a clue, because what this whole theory is shaped by is the experience of building objective science in a third-person standpoint. Terribly important realization of our civilization, but one that it would be absurd to think was the only use of language. So that is one dimension in which we have, in this HHH, this Triple H, a quite different kind of theory. It leaves room for the constitutive. There's a second form of the constitutive, which is, I think, very important to bring up, which is not the same as this first one, and that is The one that arises, this first one arises when we develop a new vocabulary for understanding experience. The one I want to look at now arises not so much out of new vocabulary, but out of discourse itself. And I think this is something totally neglected by the HLC, but which has been very interestingly developed in the 20th century. Émile Benveniste, the great French linguist, developed this, and he makes a distinction between language, langue, and discours. It's not the same distinction as Saussure's distinction between langue et parole, langue and language and speech. This is language and discourse. What does he mean? He means that when human beings talk to each other, they create a discourse situation, and we can see this reflected always in human grammar, right? That there's I speaking to you about her, or him, or them, right? There are three, as it were, three pronouns that are used, and the I and the you plural, you singular, form the speech situation, and of course we change back and forth the semantic turn in addressing each other in this way. Now, the speech situation is very important, partly because the logic of all our deictic expressions depends on it. Here, there, now, then, yesterday, day before, yesterday, and so on, all have to be related to the speech situation, and that's important enough. That's important enough to, as it were, reveal the importance of this in human language. But there's another dimension which is even more important, I think, which is that these speech situations are very rich and varied situations in which permanent relations are built up or broken down between people. I mean, okay, let's imagine I'm addressing you, and I can address you in several tones of voice. You know, I could speak down to you as a bunch of idiots and words of one syllable carefully explaining, right? Or I could be eagerly saying, I would like you to see this point, and so on. Or I could be addressing you as people totally outside my beautiful scientific bubble. Or I could be addressing you as very superior beings on whom my fate depends, and so on. All this is carried in any conversation by tone of voice, by vocabulary, by the way we hold ourselves, and we're always doing that, right? I mean, think of what people call a avuncular relation. So I relate to you in an avuncular relation. I'm so kindly, but obviously the kindly uncle, and you better listen to my advice because I'm much wiser than you are. And you can reply, oh, thank you very much. This is very, very good, and so on. And you can reply in the nephew role, right? Okay, but what's interesting about language is that you can also rebel. Okay? You can refuse to, and sometimes you see conversations like that where somebody's trying on something with someone else and the other person is withholding, not allowing that's the footing. I use this word footing here, it's I think a crucial term. Not allowing that's the footing on which we're going to be together, no. And very interestingly, I mean, an example, of course, of this is unfortunately English has lost this, but most other languages that we know have a difference between, well, French, tu and vous, or German, du and sie, and so on, right? The difference between intimate address and more formal address. Now, we've seen a revolution in our Western societies in the last few decades in which the implicit hierarchy involved in these expressions or involved in certain uses of these expressions has been broken down by simply a rebellion. I mean, for instance, when I was a child in Quebec, we addressed our parents as vous, and they addressed us as tu, right? So there was a asymmetry, right? And of course, between masters and servants and so on, there'd been for a long time this kind of asymmetry. It's totally gone. When I explain to my grandchildren, they think, you come from the Middle Ages, I mean, it's kind of weird. Really? Is that possible? It's completely gone off the screen. And we have this in a number of other European languages that people have found a way to challenge that. See? So what happens here is that these this example, this kind of hierarchical relation is coded in the speech, in this case the accepted modes of address, right? But it can also be challenged. It can be challenged by people aggressively saying to somebody who's supposed to be superior, and sometimes you get a drift of the whole culture as a result of that. So you can, what I'm trying to create here is a picture of the way in which, once again, we have modes of behavior and modes of naming them. We now have that in the domain of what I've just been calling footings, right? So we can talk about something like avuncular relation, which is a way of grasping a certain kind of relationship, which is coded in the way people talk to each other, in the registers with which they talk to each other. So we have, in a way, analogous to the earlier example of our ethical life, where you have modes of practice which are carrying out the ethic, and then descriptions of what's going on. We have here, again, a word like avuncular on one hand, and the actual practice of this asymmetric mode of address and mode of stance and so on the other. And once again, we're in an antiphonal situation where you have to move back from one to the other. If you just read some anthropologists, they're very good anthropologists, but nevertheless, just to read an anthropologist about a very foreign culture to you, or not necessarily an anthropologist, but somebody describing foreign culture to you, and you think that you can just get away with a general vocabulary, equal, unequal, and so on, you are grievously wrong. In order to understand how to operate in that culture, how to change that culture, you have to get the feel of what it is to be in one of those relations, on one of those footings, reenacting it or resisting the reenacting it as you go along. So that's a second dimension of the constitutional, you see, of the constitutive. And so once again, if we return to the attempt by the HLC to conceive language almost entirely in what I've called the first semantic logic. First, there's an object there, a new kind of rodent or something like that, and then we find a name for it. You find that you're missing a great deal of what actually goes on in language, which is that either in the development of our vocabulary for human meanings or in our modes of address to each other, we are creating extremely important human realities, right? Understandings of our ethical life on one hand, footings on the other hand. We're actually creating them, constituting them, maybe changing them, and so on. So you need this antiphonal relationship between the language of description and some grasp of what it is to participate in the actual relations, and you have to go from one to the other until you finally get a grasp of what's going on in an alien culture, or maybe it's even parts of your culture that you don't understand very well. All right, so this gives us a sense of what the deep distinction is between these two theories. You see, on one hand, we have, in a certain sense, language as an instrument, doesn't touch us, doesn't touch how we are, what our goals are, what our fundamental values are, but it's just an instrument which we can use to build up our scientific grasp of the world. In the other case, we have a theory which sees language in its different uses. In this case, the uses of devising vocabulary out of practices and back, the use of building relations and footings and naming them and so on. We see this as language is operating here in a way which very much changes the way we live in the world, the way we live in the world among other human beings. As great a change as you see between highly inegalitarian cultures where you barely dare address your superiors except in some very elaborate third person. Est-ce que Madame voudrait du thé? You have to use the kind of third person reference on one hand to modern-day Sweden or Quebec or most Australia as well. You're well known like G'day mate. But this is I'm sure a caricature. I have to live here a bit longer before, but very egalitarian culture. You see, so you get these tremendous differences in the way we live in the world, with other human beings, which are mediated by linguistic practices. That's one of the really big distinctions between these two theories, but there are others. Now, just a minute, I don't want to go on too long, but there are others which flow from this, or which are connected to this. The next set of differences that I want to talk about concern two kinds of holism. The holism of languages, of a language, and the holism of the speakers of a language, the way they form communities. The holism of language first. See, Herder is very clear in his famous, what kicked this off in a way was his treatise on the origin of language. That is, he put it, the introduction of language, becoming a language animal, introduced what he called reflectivity, reflection, Besonnenheit, right? That is, when I use a certain expression, I'm aware that there's an issue. Is that the right expression? Or is it slightly off? And indeed, now we move over to Humboldt. The way Humboldt tackles this, he says we're always finding new things that we want to express, and we're having real trouble. We have a difficulty finding the words for it, we're struggling for it. So we have a sense that we will know when we arrive at it. Yeah, that's it, right? In other words, there is this self-conscious dimension, which we're not always worried about, but only when we're trying to get something right, that there's a correct way of speaking. Now, this requires a view of language which is holistic in the following sense, that the language as a whole pre-exists and is necessary as a pre-existing background for introducing any new term, new expression, and so on, because it's the language as a whole which gives one the sense of what is right, what is the right expression, what is the wrong expression. And so you couldn't have, for instance, a human language which was introduced by first one word you learn, then a second word, and a one-word lexicon, a two-word lexicon. That's really not conceivable, which means that if we want to look at ontogenesis, we have to recognize that in the course of moving from the child's first word to full language, something changes in what's going on. I want to talk about that in a minute, right? So theories, people who develop theories of language among chimpanzees, for instance, say, wow, Wacko or whoever it is, Washoe, sorry, Washoe has developed one symbol which she can communicate with, right? That's totally unlike human language. Animals can learn tricks. You say newspaper and the dog goes to fetch the newspaper, and then you say slippers and the dog may go to fetch the slippers, and you can build up one by one. Human language is not like that. So, this is of course what Saussure and so on have been telling us. There is a holism of language which tells us something very important about the nature of language. But then there also is something else. There's a holism, as it were, between human beings. And let's now go back to the ontogenetic question. Here we have recent work by people like Tomasello and Jerome Bruner and so on, studying very closely the learning of language among children. And this is well after Herder and Humboldt, although Herder and Humboldt were very clear that language is something between human beings, that language is continuously nourished in conversation. But here we get an even clearer view of that. Tomasello makes this point that children only learn language out of what he calls joint attention frames, where the mother and the child, the father and the child, the caretaker and the child are focusing on the same thing together. It's very hard to find analogs, even in very close relatives of ours among the great apes. That is, of their directing attention so that we're both focusing together on this object. Joint attention frames, you might say some kind of, I would like to argue, some kind of communion exists between the parent or the guardian or the older person teaching language and the child. And out of that comes the learning of language. So it's not at all, again, like the HLC assumed. I have an idea in my mind, I clothe it in a word and I send it on to you and you pick it up. On the contrary, there is this, and we sense this all the time in human life. When we're really having a conversation, we're getting at something together. Okay, let me give you an example I think illustrates this. I mean, it's for us and not for me and for you. So, I'm the Russian foreign minister and I'm saying to you, Lavrov, the Ukrainians shot down the Malaysian Airlines plane. Now, I'm lying. You, Australian foreign minister, whatever, know I'm lying. I know that you know I'm lying. You know that I know that you know, and so on. But it's very different from bringing it out, right? So there's a difference between I know that you know that I know that you know, etc. on one hand, and it's being something out there between us, which would happen if I admit, okay, we all make mistakes. We didn't know these bohos would shoot anything out of the sky. We're very sorry, etc. Not likely to happen, but you can see that there's a huge difference in a normal human conversation. What we're talking about is for us and not for me, for you, and you know it's for me, and I know that you know and I know, etc. And it's that feature of language which is there from the very beginning. So you might even argue, as Alison Gopnik does in his very interesting book, The Philosophical Baby, you can even argue that, in a certain sense, in human identities, the we precedes the I. That children learn a certain description of the world around them, and that is the description. Not my description, your description, but the description. And out of that, they evolve a sense of, well, there are different points of view. They come later. So they get this fascinating experiment. I don't know if you've seen this, that with children, they bring in boxes which look as though they contain Smarties, but actually when they rip them open, they contain pencils, right? So first group of children go through this disappointing experience. Then they're put in the kind of bleachers watching as another group come in. And the experimenters ask the watching children, what do these kids think are in the boxes? Below a certain age, they say pencils, right? Above a certain age, they say, oh, these poor kids, they think they're Smarties, they're going to be very easy. Because that as the evolution gets to the point where you begin to understand that within the common language there are different standpoints, right? And this goes along with the development of the full human identity, the sense of control of your life, past and the future you can relate, and so on. So you might almost argue that the we consciousness, or maybe it's not even we, it's the consciousness of the world, the picture of the world, is prior to our having a sense of, here, we're all looking at it from our own point of view. And if I'm going to convince you, I have to put it in ways that you can understand and so on. So there again, we have something totally off the radar, if you like, of the HLC, but something that is not only anticipated by Humboldt, for instance, the famous Hölderlin poem, Seid ein Gespräch, wir sind, we are since a conversation, we are, right? As we human beings are. But here, the latest scientific research shows that that is what is actually going on, and that the most important, I mean, a tremendously important feature in the evolution of language in hominids and human beings is precisely these emotional capacities to feel in communion with other people, to feel that we are together in this. Without that, we wouldn't be able to hand language on, right? So you can see that as we move through the avenues that the HHH, the Triple H, opens out for us to explore language, we see more and more that it's not simply an instrument. Now, why is the idea that it isn't simply an instrument so tremendously powerful? I mean, which you can see because a whole lot of people, when they take up the question of language, are really assuming that what language is for is encoding information, right? That's what it's all about, it's encoding information. So you get, and tremendously interesting stuff is written on that assumption, and some of it is very, very useful. For instance, the tremendously important attempt to understand how we encode and how we develop grammars, and whether the Chomskyan idea, whether the grammars are all very, very similar and involve ringing certain recognized changes or not, with the corresponding distinction between competence and performance and so on. All these things are developed, and some of them are very interesting, but they're all based on the idea that what language is all about, what it's for, is encoding information. Now, if you think of the requirements of what we think of as a modern science of the world, or even a science of human beings carried out in the stance of natural science, where observers are looking at the objects, and the objects can be human beings behaving and developing theories about that, then it's got to be according to the semantic logic that's laid down by the HLC. First, the object is there, and we examine it closely, then we find terms that can allow us to describe, predict, and eventually control, and so on. So if that's all that, if you have that as a primary goal, you're always going to return to that particular view of language, which is fine. I mean, that's a very, very important function in modern human life, the development of this kind of science. And if we didn't know how to have that kind of objective, descriptive language, we would be crippled for a lot of our activities. But it's absurd to think that that's how human beings operate all the time, right? That language also has all these other places in human life, right? And that can't be ignored when we're asking the question, what's language like? What I was trying to say in the subtitle of the book, what is the shape of the human linguistic capacity? It's not all making science. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't even get to the point of being able to make science unless we were brought up, taught the language, learned certain things at school, learned certain disciplines and so on. The whole business of getting there to where we can be scientists is something that requires the kind of relationship with others, learning from others, which can only be understood if we see language as more than that, as doing more than that, as altering our way of being in the world. Now, ça suffit. Just one more point then. That another very important thing about the HLC is they're all raging against tropes and metaphors, right? And you can see why. I mean, Hobbes and Locke and Contiac are all saying, look, you have to start off with certain words which are linked to certain phenomena, and that's the strict definition. And then you build up a larger picture of the world. But if you start fiddling around with those definitions, you're going to get all confused. What is it? You get entangled in lime twigs, the great phrase from Hobbes and so on, and you total confusion, right? So you've got to be very clear about your definitions. Now, metaphors crazy because you know what's the exact scope of the definition. Metaphors are where two descriptions are clashing in a certain sense, right? That you have something that you could perhaps render in a direct way, and then you have it's being seen through another template. And the famous example of Max Black, the chairman plowed through the discussion. He's trying to give the idea that the chairman is dominating and pushing people around and so on. So you use this image of the farmer plowing, very ruthlessly and continuously, a furrow in the soil, and that reveals a certain aspect of this phenomenon. But if you had to take that sentence and use it in a deductive system, imagine you're using it in a regimented deductive system, you'll be in big trouble. I mean, what features of the farmer plowing carry over to this description? And so when you want to make deductions, where do you go from here? So get rid of them. So we get these incredible denunciations of metaphors. Bentham denounces metaphors, and he says, the human life has two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, and we are chained to the throne. Hey, Jeremy, stop for a minute. This is not kosher language. But you see, they can't avoid it. Well, the thing is that if you look at metaphors and metaphor-like expressions, where we understand one thing by taking something from another domain, taking a vision from another domain, like the case of a Max Black example, the chairman plowed through the discussion, you see that that's not only very common in human life, it's indispensable. We don't have, that's one of the problems that Bergson pointed out. We don't have a lot of language for time, which doesn't in some way or other spatialize it. Time flowing, or time is flowing past us, right? So spatialization, and if we were careful, we can see that we can agree with Bergson and of course Heidegger and others that lived time is very different from that, but we don't have the language for it. And we can go on and on and on with cases, very good, at my age, you forget names, it'll come back to me, Johnson and Locke, thank you very much. They have very metaphors we live by, templates we live by. This is something we see how indispensable that is. So it's another assumption of this theory, which is just wrong, but which is not totally wrong, right? If you want to have a very rigorous scientific language, don't use them, right? Or if you use them, it's just for, deep physics is full of images of this kind, but the rigor is supposedly carried by the mathematics, right? So we have quarks, and we have charm, one of the forces, etc. Right? And so that's okay because the rigor is carried by the math, right? But if you want to have a rigorous language, you can't use them the way we do in everyday life. So we get a series of differences, and we can see how they all relate together, really, by seeing the difference between language treated as an instrument where the goals pre-exist this instrument, right? The goal is to grasp the world, and now we develop a language which is ideal from this point of view, right? On one hand, and language as something, the introduction of which, or the growth of which, in a certain animal species, transforms what it is to be in the world, what it is to be in the world with other human beings, right? So, I'll finish off by going back to Aristotle. Where else can you talk? So the point about knowing that we're language animals is the point of being able to determine what our excellence, what our arete is, what our, the best development. If the HLC were right, then the best development is where we have the most objective, held at a distance, instrumental language. But if we're looking at all these other dimensions, in which language figures, then, I mean, I won't try to enumerate it, but what is the best development of language? Yeah, it's in some sense rationality, but what does rationality mean, right? Does it simply mean, rationality in our day can easily be collapsed into this kind of objective, held at a distance scientific language, but that can't be the whole human excellence involved in our being language animals if language is doing all these other things for us at the same time. So it has some relevance to the goals of the Institute. Well, thank you very much for your very kind attention.
We'll pass around a microphone to anyone who would like to begin. There's a question right there, please. Charlotte.
Thank you. Charlotte Epstein, University of Sydney. I really enjoy your persistent effort to rehabilitate language at a time where I do find that in some parts of thought it is disappearing from sight in favor of things material, etc., etc. I would perhaps like to rebel with by making 2 points on either side of the distinction you make. The first one concerns the HLC side of things, and in particular your interpretation, or what I would like to decouple a little more is the way you associate Hobbes with Locke and Condillac. Because it seems to me, in my reading of Hobbes, that there is something not just trivial, but absolutely central to Hobbes' thinking that has to do with constitution and this constitutiveness. So I completely follow you with the sort of scientific language and the science. However, there's a crucial difference, and Hobbes is the one who makes it by creating a science of the political, right? And there is, it seems to me, something that the Leviathan, that which it follows from the signing of the contract, does, which is absolutely constitutive in language terms, right? Without the Leviathan, the good means what's good for me. After the Leviathan fixes the signifier good to something that we can all understand, and that's profoundly constitutive. So in my understanding, I perhaps would bring Hobbes closer to the other side. There's something central to this constitution, and it has to do with language, and that's why I also think that Hobbes does make language central to us as political animals. So that's on that side. And the other side is that since I know you were working on the Romantics, but then you veered into the 20th century and the linguists, and then it did make me wonder, certainly on the constitutive side, why you then stopped at the linguists and didn't include someone like Lacan, right? For whom the symbolic, the signifier, and all that is absolutely preceding and previous and already there, and the child is born into something and the signifier then becomes determinant of our entire existence and our experience of the world. And I say that because I do think that Lacan would also change a little bit what I see as a perhaps too happy socialization that follows from your interpretation, because once you look at this relationship to language via Lacan's eyes, there's a lot more, the difficulty of going from the immediate to the immediate. It brings us in the dimension of loss, the inability to express yourself, etc., etc. And it's not just the child learning how to speak in a happy communion moment. There's also a lot of anxiety and loss that goes into socialization. So that was just to mix things up.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I mean, I think it's two very important points. Now, on the Hobbes side, I would say that there's something like the constitutive, but it collapses into the stipulative. That we, in virtue of setting up the sovereign, we stipulate that what they say is right, etc. And this is the constitutive that I'm talking about is very, very different from that, right? And when you get to that as a way of understanding politics, Hobbes' way of understanding politics, to my mind, is incredibly thin. It has no room for culture. It has no room for the understanding that develops in tribal life and so on. It's all based on an atomism that nobody ever lived, but that is assumed as, it's shot out of some theoretical space. So I don't feel, I see there's a point, another kind of constitutive going on here, but it's very different from the constitutive that I'm talking about. On the other side, yeah, I agree with you, it's much more stressful and much more... is Lacan the best theorist for that? I have really severe doubts about that. I have even severe doubts whether anybody really fully understands what Lacan was trying to say. I mean, Zizek has a theory which is quite interesting, but you know, it's what insight does he give into actually meeting the real distortions that happen between parents and children and bringing them out of that? You know? I'm very skeptical about that. But I mean, your point that I wasn't giving a general picture, which is always true. I'm just saying that without this kind of joint attention, you wouldn't have language. But it isn't not always happy. I entirely agree with you. Yeah, that's a very good point.
1 and 2 there, and I'll come down to this one, number 3. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Possibly it's just a question maybe on that triple H side of things. I can't really comment so much on Humboldt, but Hamann and Herder, I think you've got a very interesting point on the constitutive. My only problem would be is that in the 18th century, I suppose there is that philological turn that with the discovery of Sanskrit and European thinking, that then starts to understand the constitutive as being located in a German-speaking land, and that especially vis-a-vis the Aryan race. And I'm wondering to what degree you can get away from the romanticist or even idealist tendency towards a kind of racial ontology. And I wonder, given your other works, to what degree you can do something like that, give a basis for the constitutive that doesn't go into the biological or racial, but at the same time, I think this is what you would want, maybe I'm wrong, would defend the sense of the secular.
Well, suddenly the secular got in, I don't understand. But the first part of the question, yeah, I think it's very, very important. But Herder is totally free from what you are talking about. Herder recognized not only that Germans should develop their own language and not simply always take on French and so on like Frederick the Great, but he felt exactly the same about Slavic peoples who shouldn't take on what they're given by the Germans. It's not an accident that Masaryk, the founder of Czechoslovakia, was a great reader of Herder. So he really was a universalist. He really was a universalist that wanted to maintain these cultural differences and work towards a harmony of human beings. Now, that whole set of ideas could be then captured by this racialist. And yeah, this is always a danger. There's always a danger that these alien forces can obtrude. But it isn't written in the nature of the theory because the originator of this theory it was not at all, didn't at all deserve any of those strictures. He really, really saw that he, of course, passed part of his life in Riga. He's not somebody who thought of German as somehow, and it's not like Heidegger, German and Greek are the only two languages you can think in, and so not at all.
There's a question here. Would you mind introducing yourself when you begin?
John Quilter, School of Philosophy here. Just a clarification first. The designative instrumental conception of language, I take it, especially given the move that you made at the end, isn't to be sat alongside coordinate with the expressivist constitutive theory, aspects of language. They're not sort of two hermetically sealed aspects of one bigger reality. I take it the thought is that the constitutive expressive stuff is deeper and provides more explanatory power for even the designative aspects. So the question I have is this. Take someone like Blackburn, who accommodates a lot of the sort of thing that you're observing about constitutive and expressive aspects of language into a bigger designative picture, but shunts it off into the subjective. So the question I have there is, what do you do with truth to take on that question?
Yeah, okay, that's a very important question. That obviously, here I'm going to disagree with Simon in many respects. A lot of his work I find very, very useful. That when you're coming to these, what I call human meanings earlier, the ethical meanings and so on, it could easily look like, because the change of vocabulary changes the experience, it could easily look like there isn't any objectivity here at all. There is just whatever seems to me to be sort of meaningful and insightful, that dictates the nature of this experience of these goals for me, and that's the end of it. But that's plainly not the case, because there are two issues of truth, two issues of objectivity here that always impinge. Number one, there's a descriptive one. Remember I said earlier that imagining the case where I think that I'm reacting out of remorse for what I did, and actually I'm worried about my image, right? That is either a discovery or a fault. I mean, when I make that discovery, it either is valid or not valid. The second dimension is that obviously we want to say that our basic notions of what's right and wrong, that there is a truth or a basic right and wrong about that. Now, we could go into, it would take a whole other lecture to talk about how exactly we apply reason here. But just very, very briefly, I would argue that we have arguments, but they're hermeneutic arguments. They are arguments to the effect that this interpretation, this reading of these events, of my reaction or so on, are much more plausible. They make better human sense, better human understanding of this passage of history, this passage of my biography. And we can make these arguments. They don't have, the hermeneutic arguments don't have the character either of reaching absolutely knockdown arguments, that there's no further reply possible, or they don't also have another character, the character of arriving, which I guess would be in some ways the same as the first, the character of arriving at an unimprovable account, right? That no further remarks can be made, no further consideration can be put forward, saying that's not really satisfactory interpretation, let's move it a little bit this way in order to get closer to the reality. So, and in that way, it's felt to be very unsatisfactory by people for whom the hermeneutic is irredeemably messy, uncertain, and so on. But it's the nature of human beings that we're stuck with that. We're always dealing with an attempt to understand ourselves and each other, and we never can arrive at knockdown arguments, but we can arrive at the perception that this account takes it more into account, deals more with the situation, makes more human sense of the situation than that account.
Over here. But you're next.
Thanks very much for your address, Professor Taylor. Robert Gascoigne, Theology, ACU. Thank you.
It's well known that you've made very significant contributions to the debate about multiculturalism, both at an academic level and in terms of public debate in Canada. So my question, I'd like to invite you to comment on the implications of the two different theories of language, both in terms of how we understand cultural distinctiveness and how we understand dialogue at a linguistic and cultural level, and perhaps also the implications of dialogue at the socio-political level. So distinctiveness, universality relationship in terms of those two different theories. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Well, I suppose they could say that the HLC doesn't have very much to say about, that doesn't have any room to make sense of the idea of very different cultural takes. So what I'm tempted to do is to bring Gadamer into the conversation. Gadamer, I think, has made a brilliant attempt to give an account of what it would be to have a conversation where we come enough to common points of reference that we can come to a common understanding of what the differences are between our views. And I suppose you could say that the sense that languages encode a worldview and they can be different from each other is inseparable from the HHH. I mean, indeed, that's what Herder was talking about the whole time. I mean, I'll be autobiographical. I'm onto this because I was brought up in Montreal, right? There were two languages, and a lot of people didn't understand the other at all, right? But Anglophones tended to say, well, language is just for communication, more people speak English than speak French around here, so why don't you French people drop all this stuff and speak English, and then we can understand each other, right? And Québécois said, no, I mean, language is a way, it's a sense of humor, it's a whole way of experiencing the world. So I sat there and I realized these guys are right. The Francophones are right here. This is so evident that they were misunderstanding each other or passing each other by. Yeah. But that very, privileged position, very painful sometimes. A privileged position I was primed to read Herder by my childhood, right? And when I read Herder, wow.
Back here? Yeah. Yes. No, I'm pointing to you, exactly, you, yes.
What did you get a microphone? Microphone is coming, yeah.
Hi, I'm Sandy Lynch from the University of Notre Dame. I was interested in your example about being remorseful. So if I tell you that I'm remorseful but you don't believe me, you understand that I'm interested in my own image. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about what you think is the catalyst to that, obviously in its tone of voice or your skeptical facial expression when I'm speaking. But if you compare that, what sets that off by comparison with the example of the mother and the baby, and that I think is about kind of playing in what's referred to as the in-between, between the mother and the child. I wondered if you might talk just a little bit about what the catalysts are for that. Is it dissonance? Is it play? Is it more things? Yeah.
Well, I think that we develop. I mean, there are, of course. I mean, to get back to your earlier question, there are blockages in this, which we sometimes use the word autism for, right? Where people don't get to pick up those signals, right? But if in most cases, from the very beginning, both parties are very sensitive to what's going on in the interlocutor, and just in our ordinary conversations, we may be blocking it out, not because we're not interested in that, we're interested in me cutting a deal and so on, but when we want to, we can pick up a tremendous amount of what's going on, what the emotions are, the uncertainties, the real conviction is against just pro forma conviction and so on. We're really, human beings are, almost say, programmed to do that, because we couldn't have the kind of relationships we have in human life without that. We couldn't have a real love relation if you weren't picking these things up all the time. So I don't think there's any particular catalyst. I mean, it can be through play, as very often is with a caretaker and a child, but there are all sorts of other ways in which we pick things up. And even involuntarily, we find ourselves thinking, this person is really sincere, this person is phony, and so on as we hear them talk. You know, you can't stop yourself. You go, oh, I don't want to judge. But you can't help picking up this information.
There's a question back there first, and if yeah.
My name is Matt. I'm not from the
Welcome.
The elder who gave the welcome to country, Jennifer Newman, a Wiradjuri lady, she mentioned an officer, William Dawes. He was an astronomer and a man of the Enlightenment very much. But I think he probably didn't get much out of HLC when he was doing language with a young lady. Her name was Patagram. And you know, he learned so many amazing words. I don't know how to pronounce this.
Who are you talking about?
Okay, so there's an Indigenous woman.
Oh, yes.
In 1788.
Okay.
She's maybe 13 years old. Her name is Patagarang. She's an Eora woman.
Yeah.
And she tells him about 2,000 words and phrases. One of the words is, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it means the warmth that comes when you put your back of your hand to the fire and you transfer it to another person's cheek. There's one word for that. Mm-hmm. Now, HCL would just give nothing for that. You know, why would you invest in learning that word? But I just wonder if William Dawes, and we know him to be an evangelical, got more out of AME rather than, which would be Abraham, Moses and Elijah. And their foundational stories that God said to Adam and Eve, you name the animals.
Yeah.
And what you name them, that will be their name. I will be the semantic guarantor, but you name them. And so when you meet a girl called Patagram on the other side of the planet, and she says, this is the word for this thing, that has meaning. There's already there's a common semantic denomination that they can both bank on there. Am I right in thinking that or not?
Well, yeah, but sorry, that original Genesis passage can be understood in two very different ways, right? Now, when I was talking about earlier about in the High Renaissance, there were these ideas of a cosmically embedded language. Someone like Flood understood that passage to mean that Adam had a real insight into the nature of things, right? So that, so that's why, you know, what he named them. So the name was not simply a name. The name was a way of grasping the very essence of the thing concerned. If then you flip ahead to the demise of that kind of outlook, and you get the Bible passages read rather like the sovereign in Hobbes. This is it, right? This is the meaning, right? And then the thing goes totally dead. I mean, there isn't, that language is purely designative language. And of course, that lies behind, when you go to an extreme, it lies behind biblical fundamentalism, which we, on our continent, is wafting north from the great neighbor to the south. And that, of course, is, I think, I'm theological neophyte or challenges all, but it seems to me to be theologically insane. I mean, nothing to do with what the Bible is as a text. So I think, I don't know about this evangelical reverence you're talking about. I don't know which side of the fence he's on, but quite likely he could be on the, what I consider the wrong side, the purely designative side, and then you can see the tremendous difference between that, why that concept becomes a concept. It's not the concept that's going to fit into that kind of objective scientific theory. It's a concept which can as it were, both hook you into and therefore transform you what goes on between human beings in that kind of situation, yeah. And that's where we get, you see, that this whole HHH, then it slides into the basis for a theory of poetics in which this idea of reconnecting to the universe. You've had it with Wordsworth, you've had it with Hölderlin, you see. You know, there's a whole set of, next lecture, in 5 years' time. I'll come.
So 3 questions I'll take. There's one here, there's one here, and one here. So kind of like a little line right here, and we'll end there.
Who's first?
Paul Oslington from Alpha Christus College, Pentecostal College in Parramatta. My question's about the discussion at the beginning about the sort of animal we are. And as a comment, Adam Smith's take on that is that we're an animal, but there's a lot of similarity between the way language works and the way markets and trade work. And the thing that's distinctive about us is that we're an animal that trades purposely with others. And Smith wrote a lot about those sort of analogies. But it occurred to me that if there's anything in what Smith is doing there by extending Aristotle's conception, that there's maybe wondering whether there's a similar analogy between the ways we look at economies, the 2 ways we look at economies, similar to the 2 ways you're looking at language. So there's one way which would correspond to the Hobbes and the Locke and the Condiac, where an economy, where markets are transparent, simple. There's nothing to them. It's human interests, and markets don't really do anything very important. They're morally neutral. And a second way of looking at markets, where markets are constitutive of culture, where they're a lot thicker. It seems to me that if we are going to push that, the Smith is very much on the second side. But I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on whether Smith's extension of that has anything in it, and whether, if so, there might be a similar way of looking at economies as we look at languages.
Yeah, well, I mean, really the answer is yes and no, because what do we mean by culture and what do we mean by cultural difference? There's a huge difference between a culture in which what we understand as markets operate, where I don't need any kind of like thick or intimate or powerful relationship to you. We just, you're selling a pig and I'm buying and we haggle and we get a price and I walk away, on one hand. And societies like Marx and Mauss deals with, right, where gift exchange is really crucial because it's what creates, or Bourdieu talking about Kabini, it really creates the social relation. So what was needed in order to develop modern markets is a thinning out of these relationships, right? And therefore the creation of something which we can consider as a kind of mechanism just operating on its own without any, as it were, moral connection or emotional connection. And it's very important that we live in a civilization in which there are all sorts of structures of that kind, including bureaucratic structures and market structures, so that we're very different from the kind of people that Marcel Mauss wrote about. Okay, but then, maybe we're not, we've lost something very, very considerable there. We've lost a sense of the gift exchange. Not that we could replace our entire economy that goes through markets with gift exchange, but we've lost, I think, some of the deeper human value, even theological value, of understanding the gift exchange, which is kind of pushed to the margins. In Christmas time you give Aunt Mabel something or other, and she gives you something or other, and so on. But it's not as, to use this expression that Clifford Geertz uses, not as thick a set of customs as the original gift exchange. But we really need to understand how markets evolved beyond, in a terrain, leaving behind them gift exchange, in order to see the gains and losses. And there are tons of losses.
Please.
Thank you. My name is John Atkins. I'm also a visitor to the campus tonight. What I'd like to ask you is what you think the expressivist view of language has to offer in terms of critique of political discourse today. I refer, for example, to discussions and debates, for example, in economics, where words have a moral dimension. So debt is bad, deficit is bad, tax is bad. It seems that these notions not only have a moral dimension, but they're also tied up with a particular theory.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, in terms of the language that's used, the language is not used to reveal, rather it's revealed to mask and to manipulate. And it seems to me that that's the primary aspect of political debates today. So my question to you is how, in terms of your concept of language, and how language could be used more usefully or illuminatingly, how can that provide a critique for the highly manipulative and distortive way that language is used, particularly by politicians?
Yeah, well, it doesn't necessarily, in one way it does, in one way it doesn't. I mean, I entirely agree with you, because I think we probably share our views about the current understanding of our society. And I think that it's definitely, it vehicles a certain false conception of the world in which we live, and it carries it forward. So that is something that an HLC thinker could grasp, right? Because you take it word by word. Someone like Orwell, someone is, you don't have to be a proponent of the other theory. But there's another dimension of that, which is the whole stance towards the world, which is vehicled by certain politicians as they speak. I mean, I won't mention Donald Trump; it's got an extreme case, but I mean, right, that some people just ooze insincerity, lies, triviality, and putting something over on you. Now that is a really expressive dimension there, the way in which you're not just imparting information, in this case false information, by using the word tax, etc., because you're as it were, referencing a theory which you want to give people the impression that everyone believes in order that they believe it. You're not just doing that, but you're also expressing what you are as a human being and so on. And that dimension of the analysis, really you need the expressivist theory to do, yeah.
The last question here.
Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. Very much enjoyed everything you've said and everything you've written. In one of your books, you mentioned that the articulation of values is an important thing. In our secular society, how do you see language contributing to fullness in our secular society?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe we have a different notion of a secular society. My notion of modern secularity is that it's primarily to be understood in terms of pluralism. That is, we're not living in religiously monochrome societies anymore, right? So what we have to do is we have to create an understanding of really fundamental principles of our society, such that people could, and we hope will, subscribe to them from very different, stances towards the universe, sense of deep value, etc. Right? So we have to develop this common, political ethic, if you like, and that is something which we still are having big trouble doing. Right? That because we're blown off course by, of course, sometimes very powerful interests. We're blown off course also by cultural fear, which arises and is arising more and more in Western type societies, right? Before certain kinds of outsiders. And this is where the big battle goes on for, returning to and getting a grasp of our fundamental ethic so that we don't scapegoat, we don't, put stereotypes onto people from the outside, and Muslims dangerous and so on, where we have to fight, very hard.
I want want to thank Professor Taylor for this magnificent talk and performance. Thank you.